If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. This episode is a Pause to Ponder segment. These bi-weekly sessions will allow me to share with you my personal thoughts and reflections on a wide spectrum of topics as they relate to education. It is my hope that you will be able to take something from these segments and apply it in a meaningful way as you continue to do amazing work. Remember, while we all have different roles, we all have a single job: educating our students. If you haven't listened to Nice White Parents, a 5-part podcast hosted by the New York Times Company about building a better school system and what gets in the way, I need you to do me a favor. Listen to it as soon as you can. I mean, maybe after this episode, but as soon as you can. The 5 episodes are about an hour each, and if you listen like I did, it should only take you a day or so. I'd like to thank Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, a colleague and upcoming guest on this show, for introducing it to me. My wife, on the other hand, was not so thrilled whenever I walked through the door, riled up by another episode. I'm sure that once you begin listening, you'll understand. Therefore, please allow me to apologize to those in your immediate circle. You know what? On second thought, no, I won't apologize. And you know why? Because this conversation needs to be had. And if this podcast spurs those conversations, as I know it has for anyone around me, then good. This episode isn't intended to be a retelling or even a summarizing of the series, so much as I hope to capture the numerous conflicting thoughts and feelings that I experienced as I listened to each part of the narrative. To give you some context, however, the series chronicles an educational reporter, Chana, as she explores decades of reform initiatives within schools, specifically those in New York, to determine the biggest driving force behind the decisions that were ultimately being made. While some of the revelations she shares may be common knowledge for some of us, others are astounding and disturbing. Or maybe they simply confirm something that we've known for far too long: that schools, for the most part, are not designed for Black and brown students. There are 3 themes that seem to stand out for me as I listen to the series, in the crazy, yet very real, accounts of what took place not just in New York, but in our country's educational past. The first is that in order to be truly have equity, or even equality, individuals need to be committed to the cause. They need to be ready to put in the work. And you know what? This work isn't easy. It's messy and it's convoluted. It's controversial and divisive. It's extensive and exhaustive. Unfortunately, so many people who are attracted to the allure of equity, to the buzz that surrounds the concept, to the attention that it brings, abandon the effort as soon as those romanticized notions are thrust into unforgiving reality. Throughout the series, we hear accounts of parents who pushed for reforms, many of whom did so with passion and zeal, who wrote letters and spoke to the media, only to abandon the project once those fiery intentions dwindled to smoldering embers. In fact, one parent stated that people often say things that are politically correct without taking into account their personal positions. This made it easy to walk away without considering whether or not the work was done or the impact of the decisions that were made. Another is the misconception between equality and equity, between that which those who have been historically oppressed are seeking and the interpretation by those who have benefited from those same systems of oppression. So you see, equality and equity, they're not the same thing. In the most simplistic terms, equality refers to the idea that everyone gets the same thing, while equity refers to the concept that everyone receives what they need. What marginalized populations in this country have been seeking is equity. We want to receive that which we need in order to be successful, in order to have a life that is meaningful and productive. Yes, sometimes this means equality, equal pay, equal treatment, equal opportunities, and therein lies the perceived danger for those on the other side. Consider school funding. There exists a limited amount of money that is distributed to schools according to whatever formulas are in place. With current models utilizing the property tax system, schools within wealthier neighborhoods receive a much larger share of those funds. After all, those who live in these neighborhoods generally pay considerably more property taxes than those in neighboring communities of poverty, and shouldn't their children not benefit from this? A suggestion to develop more equal school funding formula would result in many schools receiving less funding, while others received more. And that is where the issue lies. While many are self-proclaimed proponents of equality, they're not willing to make the necessary sacrifices to level the playing field. The allure of such radical change quickly fades if ensuring that others receive more means that they might receive less. This narrative was ever present in the series as parents advocated for new schools and programs, but quickly reconsidered those stances when it appeared that they would need to sacrifice some of the comforts for which they have grown accustomed. You know what? The most interesting aspect of this is that those for whom they were fighting, those who didn't even ask for their assistance to begin with, were not necessarily seeking equality. They were seeking equity. They wanted to be provided with the tools and resources that would allow their students to be successful. If that meant receiving an equal share, then so be it. The final theme is one that is far too common, one that we see playing itself out in the chaotic world around us today. The reality that issues are only important when they impact those in power. Don't believe me? Think about the opioid crisis. When this issue was perceived as a black and brown problem, the response was the crackdown on offenders with an ongoing war on drugs. However, when this same epidemic made its way into white middle-class America, there suddenly existed a crisis that required treatments and programs. A very similar response presented itself in the podcast when a parent only realized the reality of segregation still very prevalent in New York schools once her own child was not able to make it into one of the coveted middle school spots. When she, along with others, came to this realization, they were willing to fight for integrated schools because it would mean that their students would benefit. In fact, she admitted that she probably would never have recognized how segregated the school system was had she been afforded the luxury of continuing to exist within her protected bubble. Over the past few years, I've had the privilege and honor of working on the CPS equity team. Now, there's still much work to be done. It has provided me the opportunity to examine issues from different perspectives and to gain a better and deeper understanding of what has been happening in our country and how it has shaped education. The most powerful has been a series of documents that I read that discussed how schools have traditionally been used as tools to perpetuate a system that benefits wealthy white people. That an upper class cannot exist without a lower class. That the separation between the two is critical, and therefore the continued oppression is necessary to maintain the status quo. They pointed out that we have had so many so-called reforms in this country for years, and yet few significant changes have actually occurred. These superficial attempts of addressing the root issues are a reflection of an ongoing cycle of exploration and discussion that yield the same findings, yet produce no new results. To be honest, I was critical of these accusations when I first read them. As an educator, one who is devoted to improving the lives of my students, one who strives to change the narrative around our disenfranchised communities, one who hopes to make a meaningful and lasting difference in this field, I could not fathom that our leaders would intentionally abuse such a fundamental tool. And yet, as I continued to learn, as I have continued to become more aware of my naivety, of my desperate clinging to a hope that maybe, just maybe, the world isn't as bad as it seems. Nice White Parents, as controversial as I'm sure it is, examines an aspect not often talked about when discussing school reform. The power that white parents have over the decisions that are made, both good and bad, not just for their students, but for all students. For me, it served to reinforce that which I had been struggling to accept for so long, as well as the hope that must counter such levels of doubt. Maybe the world in which we live was not intended for all of us, but that does not mean that we are powerless to be impactful. We must not resign to the overwhelming feeling of hopelessness, but instead focus on believing that we shall overcome. Until next time. I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and the host at _CW Consulting. Take care.